I am Thomas Bowles, Ag Agent in Prince William County, and I am for the soil, for the future, and for the planet.
What a pleasure it is to welcome everyone to yet another episode of For the Soil, a Conversation. I'm your host, Jeff Ishee, and our special guest today will be Virginia's Secretary of Agriculture and Forestry, Bettina Ring. She'll be joining Mary Sketch and I with the Virginia Soil Health Coalition in just a few moments. But first, I wanted to remind everyone that we're encouraging everyone to take a pledge to improve the soil health in your own world, whether it be in your backyard garden, your 400-acre row crop operation, your apple orchard, wherever you work and wherever you live. We are encouraging you to take a pledge to improve the soil in your own world, and you can start that journey by visiting our website at forthesoil.org. That is the digit 4 thesoil.org, and across the upper menu bar you'll see pledge, and we're encouraging everyone to take that pledge today. Go ahead and do it, get that out of the way, and then we'll start the podcast in just a few moments. It's so important, in my opinion, to commit yourself toward a worthy cause, and who could argue against improving soil health? We all need soil in order to sustain ourselves and our planet. So do that today, and we'll go ahead and get started with the program. Hello, everyone, and welcome everyone to another episode of For the Soil, a Conversation. I'm your host, Jeff Ishee, and Mary, I'm excited to welcome to our show a very special guest this week. In my past conversations with her, I know for a fact she has a lot of stories to share about agriculture, about forestry, and about soil health. Mary, I'll let you do the honors of introducing our special guest this week.
Thank you, Jeff. We're so grateful to have Secretary Bettina Ring with us today. Secretary Ring is the Secretary of Agriculture and Forestry for the state of Virginia and is originally from Southwest Virginia and a graduate of Virginia Tech. Go Hokies. Secretary Ring has years of experience in forestry and agriculture, both in Virginia and the Western U.S. And prior to her role as Secretary of Agriculture and Forestry, Secretary Ring was the State Forester of Virginia. So with that introduction, really, I want to turn it over to you, Secretary Ring, to introduce yourself and your background. What got you interested in agriculture, forestry, and really protecting the natural resources of our landscapes?
Thank you, Mary, and I appreciate you doing this. I appreciate your leadership and all that you're doing for soil, and the fact that you're having these podcasts, and would like to also thank Jeff for his continued work to advance our industry here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So for me, I really nerd out on soils. I get excited about them, and I think back to my childhood and sort of that connection with the land and water and the connection with the soil truly made a difference in my life and sort of my trajectory, my life's work, if you will. I think back to growing up in a small community near Roanoke, Virginia, in Craig County, living next door to my grandparents, having a chance to spend a lot of time in the garden with them, a lot of time outdoors with my family, with my parents and my grandparents and other family members. But as a young age, I would play outdoors more. I mean, I remember those days where you would have to be called back in for dinner, that you were outside all day doing something. And that meant that I had my hands in the soil, sometimes playing, making mud pies as a child, as we all did. But then thinking about the time that I spent with my grandparents in the garden, I remember this hand plow that my grandfather had. I remember the soils and just sort of the smell of the soil, and also how rich the soil was. And to watch them work the land, to plant seeds in that soil, to watch them grow and then to harvest those vegetables and to spend time then watching that full cycle, right? And how much that soil and caring for that land and that soil resulted in having wonderful fresh produce that our family could enjoy. And it just made me want to learn more, if you will. And so growing up there, we also had a small inholding. We lived in the country already, but we went out to the country within the Jefferson National Forest. At the time, it was before the GW and Jeff were combined. And we had about 40 acres that we owned with my aunt and uncle, that my dad and my uncle would work on wildlife food plots there. I would notice the difference in the soils, actually. Now that I think back to just the different rocks that you would see in that part of the county versus where I was growing up, the soil texture, and just thinking about it was much harder to grow certain things on that land that was in a more mountainous area in the county that was part of the Jefferson National Forest. But it really, again, having that sort of land ethic from my parents, from family members, helped me. I loved the outdoors, loved nature, loved everything about it, and knew that that's what I wanted to do. As I grew up, I loved biology and science, and I went on to study forestry and wildlife at Virginia Tech. And go Hokies, as you said, I'm a proud Hokie, and had the good fortune there to take a couple soils courses. And I think back to those courses, and one was a rather large class, actually, but just what we learned about the different soil types. And then when I graduated and started my career with the Department of Forestry, immediately I was taught how to use, beyond what I learned in college, how to use soil maps and how those really could help me as a forester better understand what was possible on that land for the forest, what types of trees grew where. At the time, I was working in Albemarle and Greene County, but then I would also visit other parts of our region and work with other foresters in the field to learn from them as a young forester. And soils was really the foundation of everything we did. We would look at the site indexes. We would think about what trees were growing there, what the landowner wanted to do in the future, what their objectives were. So it helped us even shape forest management plans for those landowners. It helped them think about what was possible and also what's not possible on their land. And when you think about agriculture, the soil's extremely important. Thinking about crops, what works, what doesn't, thinking about livestock, where you want to have them, when you think about rotational grazing. And so it plays such an important role. And I think now we have much more understanding about soils. I always enjoy going to the Virginia Tech field days and in particular, the Ag Expo. They show the different layers of the soils. They get people down in the soil pit. And that's always fun to go back and look at that and to think about that. And to think about also the erosion that we've had on our lands over time, the repeated use of our lands, and how we have to take care of those lands for the long term. And so reducing erosion, that's been a big part of my career, thinking about best management practices on the forestry side, what we would do to think about pre-harvest planning, what you do in advance of harvesting trees, what you do during that harvest, working with our loggers in Virginia, and what you do after the harvest to make sure that you're limiting the sediment that's leaving the site. And we would work closely with Virginia Tech. We were very proactive with the Department of Forestry in putting together a non-regulatory approach for best management practices in the state, and everyone coming together. And now to have this sharp logger program where loggers are being trained year after year. They take great pride in doing the right thing when they're out harvesting timber, and that they're really knowledgeable about installing those best management practices. And our audits show that we're doing extremely well. We're tracking what we're doing within the Chesapeake Bay watershed, as well as outside the watershed. And so when I think about, again, my career and look at the role that soils has played along the way, it's fascinating to me when I think about it, because I then moved from being in the field into an urban and community forestry role as we were establishing that program in the state of Virginia with support from the U.S. Forest Service. It was all about tree planting, the America Beautiful program as an SBA program, as well as urban and community forestry. So we had to think about those soils, much more difficult in an urban setting. much more difficult to think about what type of tree will survive those harsh environments, sometimes when the soils have just been totally depleted, and then how they can also help to restore that ecosystem. And now that I'm, had the good fortune to be out west for a while, to think about the soils out there and the role that they played. I lived in Marin County for a number of years, working in land conservation, and to see the role that soils played in that county in particular, but across the San Francisco Bay Area, and what we were able to grow in California with that year-round growing season. And now to be back in Virginia and to be serving in this role as Secretary of Agriculture and Forestry. And so it shapes everything about our industry in the state, agriculture being our #1 industry, forestry being our 3rd largest industry. And so thinking long-term, we want to make sure we're caring for those soils, that we're keeping them on the site, that we're soil keepers, if you will. As we sign that pledge, we're thinking about the future of the Commonwealth. We're thinking about making sure we can remain the #1 industry in the state with agriculture, or the 3rd largest industry with forestry. And if we don't have the healthy soils, we cannot have those abundant resources that we have, or a healthy, viable economy.
Secretary Ring, I have a specific question for you about soil profiles in Virginia, and what I'd like to hear you comment on is comparing the soil profile from I don't know if you call it a virgin forest, but a long-standing forest situation. Compare the soil profile in that situation with the typical soil profile of perhaps an open field, maybe a 200-acre cotton growing operation. Is there a major difference in those soil profiles?
That's a great question. And certainly we have different landowners, different soil types across the state, but where we've had repeated use of those lands, if certain practices have not been put in place to maintain that soil health, that you may see, erosion over time. You may see if there was an appropriate application of fertilizers or pesticides, herbicides. Again, those can be used appropriately, making sure you understand those soils and what's needed in those soils. But if that hasn't happened, if we haven't had the right even harvesting practices over time, thinking about, till and no-till. There are different things that go into thinking about how we can care for those lands moving forward, and then also what that crop may require. But then you're going to see perhaps in some places a very different soil profile in those areas than you would see in a healthy forest, for example, in an area where you have decomposition of leaves of the trees that may have fallen. And so you have that sort of continuous cycle where you're putting nutrients back into the soil, and the soil continues to get healthier and healthier, right? You're not taking out or depleting. But we can do that. We can do that no matter what we're growing, where we're growing it. We can really start to think about more deeply. And I'm not an agronomist. I would love to be, but what I know of soils and what I've seen and what we're able to do in some areas, and it just brings me so much pride to see forest landowners that really care about this and want to learn more, or farmers that care about this and want to learn more. They want their farms to be viable and successful. Those forest landowners want to grow healthier trees. So they're going to do all they can to care for those lands, but very, very different as far as that soil profile.
Secretary, looking at that combination of agriculture and forestry, I think the number is in Virginia, it's over 90 billion in economic impact. So it just plays a huge role in the economic resilience of the state. And, wondering where you see that intersection of healthy soils and our environmental resilience in both forest and agricultural lands, all working lands, and the economic well-being of the state.
They're also very connected, right? If we don't protect our environment, we cannot have a healthy economy. If we don't have a healthy economy, a viable industry out there for our farmers. If they don't have markets, if we don't have healthy businesses that are able to make a profit, then it starts to unravel, it starts to fall apart. But if you don't have healthy soils and you're not able to grow those products, you're not able to have abundant, healthy, sustainable forests or crops that are doing well, and thinking about our wine industry and how that's continuing to grow. If we're not able to care for those soils, then we're not going to make the quality products that we need that are going to actually bring more money in to that farmer to help them stay on the land, or the forest landowner, and to pass that land down to the next generation. So it's so tied together, and it's also tied to our social lives, right? To our community, to the health of our community. So there are trickle-down effects where you may have a local feed supply store, you may have forestry consultants or others that are involved in the business. And so it's lifting everybody up, and it's thinking about, in those rural communities across Virginia, what a difference one job can make, right? And putting food on the table for our family, and being able to have these viable businesses keeps those families healthy. And so it's all about health across the board, right? Healthy economy, healthy environment, and then making sure that our communities are healthy.
Very good information. Unfortunately, our time is up in this episode of For the Soil, a Conversation. We would like to highlight one of the 4 core principles of soil health, and we do that on each and every episode. And today we hear from Dr. Rory McGuire at Virginia Tech about one of those 4 core principles.
Keeping the soil covered is very important in terms of preventing soil erosion. Soil erosion is one of the biggest ways to decrease soil quality. If you lose the soil, you're losing the valuable part of your land. So keeping the soil covered prevents soil erosion. And when raindrops directly impact the soil, they can form a crust on the soil surface. They actually break the soil structure right at the soil surface. And once the soil structure is broken at the surface, you don't get any infiltration of water anymore. And of course, if water doesn't infiltrate, it runs off. And when it runs off, it takes the soil with it. So keeping the soil covered is extremely important in terms of preventing surface crust formation and soil erosion.
Also, we'd like to once again challenge each of our listeners to take a pledge to improve the soil health in your own world. You can take that pledge by visiting our website at forthesoil.org. That is the digit 4, thesoil.org. Well, Mary and Secretary Ring, it has been a real pleasure having each of you on this episode of For the Soil, a Conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Secretary Ring.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
For the Soil, a Conversation is made possible with funding support from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the Agua Fund. Other partners include the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Natural Resources Conservation Service, Virginia Cooperative Extension, Virginia State University, Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, and partners of the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. Views expressed on this podcast are those of each individual guest. To download a copy of this or any other episode, just visit the website forthesoil.org. And if you have a specific question about soil health, just contact your local extension office, your local USDA service center, or a soil and water conservation district office. Music used during today's program was provided courtesy of the Flip Charts, Mr. Smith, and Mr. Ruiz. All rights reserved. For the Soil, a Conversation is produced by On the Farm Radio in collaboration with Virginia Tech. I'm your host, Jeff Ishee.